The hunters stopped moving. The mammoth had already seen them. It turned its head, adjusted its weight slightly, and looked in their direction. It didn't run. This is the part of the story that gets left out when people talk about mammoth extinction. We imagine the hunt as something like what we know from every predator-prey relationship. The chase, the panic, the animal trying to escape. But for the first human hunters to encounter mammoths in the Americas, the hunt likely looked nothing like that. The animal stood its ground, or moved away slowly, or simply watched, because it had no reason to run, no evolutionary memory of what a group of upright, coordinated, weapon-carrying creatures meant. No inherited fear built across generations of being hunted by something like this. The mammoth didn't know what a human was, not in any way that mattered for survival. And that stillness, that absence of flight, is one of the most consequential things that ever happened between our species and theirs. Prey naivety is the term researchers use for what happens when an animal encounters a new predator it has no evolutionary preparation for. It doesn't mean the animal is unintelligent. Mammoths were highly social, likely capable of passing learned information between individuals within a herd. But there's a difference between intelligence and inherited caution. The fear response that makes a prey animal flee, the one that gets wired in as instinct, takes generations to develop. Animals have to survive by running before their offspring inherit the impulse to run. That selection pressure has to repeat across enough time for the behavior to become automatic. For hunters, that process is part of what makes prey difficult. The animal's instinct to escape is a defense. It costs you distance, stamina, surprise, time. The difficulty of the hunt is itself a kind of natural regulation, not intentional, but functional. Now remove it. A hunter approaching a mammoth that watches them calmly, that doesn't bolt, that doesn't scatter the herd, that's a fundamentally different situation. In the Americas, human hunters arrived with weapons and coordination into a world where none of the animals had been taught by their ancestors to fear them. The stillness the hunters encountered wasn't the mammoth being brave. It was a gap in millions of years of evolutionary preparation, and they walked right through it. Africa tells you what the alternative looked like. Elephants, hippos, rhinos. These animals evolved alongside Homo sapiens and our ancestors across millions of years. Their fear of humans isn't just learned individually, it's encoded, selected for across immense spans of time, because the animals without it didn't survive long enough to pass anything on. That's why African megafauna still exists at all. Not because humans there were kinder, but because the animals had millions of years to figure out what humans were. Eurasian mammoths had some of that same time, and some of them survived longer because of it. The megafauna that lasted longest in Eurasia tended to be in regions with the deepest history of human presence. The pattern is consistent. North American mammoths had none of it. The people who arrived roughly 13,000 to 14,000 years ago were a genuinely new kind of pressure. And the animals had nothing in their evolutionary history that corresponded to it. The hunts were more efficient than the ecosystem was built to absorb. Not everywhere, not every time, but consistently enough across enough of the continent that a slow reproducing species couldn't keep pace. Here's the thing about what happened next. It's the part that still unsettles me. As mammoth populations declined across the continent, something stayed constant that shouldn't have been allowed to stay constant. The remaining animals were still naive. The behavioral adaptation that might have saved them the inherited wariness, the instinct to flee at the sight or smell of humans, hadn't had time to develop. For that to happen, enough mammoths would have needed to survive long enough to pass it on. But the populations were already too fragmented, declining too fast. There was no generation of mammoths that escaped by running and went on to raise offspring that ran faster. The last mammoths in North America were behaviorally identical to the first ones humans had encountered. They still didn't know what a human was. And then there's Wrangel Island, a small remote landmass in the Arctic Ocean, cut off from the mainland. A population of mammoths survived there until around 1700 BCE. Let that land for a second. That's after the pyramids at Giza were already built. While Bronze Age civilizations were trading and writing and building monuments, there were still mammoths alive on this island. The reason they survived so long wasn't that they were smarter or stronger or luckier. It was simply that no humans had reached them. But isolation is a double-edged thing, because it also meant there had been no humans to learn from, no hunts to run from, no memory, individual or inherited, of what the danger looked like. When people finally reached Wrangel Island, the mammoths there would have been just as unafraid as the very first mammoths encountered anywhere on the continent, thousands of years earlier. They stood and watched, and then they were gone. The island didn't save them. It just delayed the moment they met something they had no answer for. So did ancient humans drive mammoths to extinction? The prey naivety evidence says yes, but the mechanism matters. It wasn't simply that humans were effective hunters, it's that they arrived in places where mammoths had no inherited answer for what humans were. The animals didn't run. The hunts applied pressure that a slow reproducing species couldn't absorb. And by the time populations were small enough that something might have shifted, there wasn't enough time or enough mammoths for any new behavior to take hold. The extinction didn't require cruelty. It didn't even require awareness of what was happening. It required hunters doing what hunters do, against prey that had no prepared response. The mammoth that stood still and watched the approaching hunters wasn't making a mistake. It was doing exactly what millions of years of evolution had prepared it to do. The problem was that nothing in those millions of years had prepared it for this.